Chapter 18. On the Farm. When I was a child, winters seemed to me more like the traditional Victorian Christmas cards. Long icicles hanging from the eaves, frosts flowering on the window panes, and frozen ponds and rivers. We didn't know about global warming then, when hoarfrosts regularly rimed leaves, grass and branches with a fine edging of white ice crystals. I remember the January and February of one of our earliest winters on the farm, when everything there still felt so strange and different from our former life in post-war London. My nose emerges from the damp warmth of blankets and eiderdown. It senses an unusual chill. I listen. Silence. Nothing stirs outside. Farmyard sounds should be welcoming the new day. I sit up in bed. I put out an arm and reach out to lift slightly the blankets that cover my little sister. All I can see are her short dark curls on the white pillow. Dragging my eiderdown round me, I climb out of bed and slip my feet into the cosy blue slippers that Mummy gave me for Christmas. There is a strange light filtering through the curtains, and the world smells different. Last night it started snowing, big white flakes floating against a backdrop of night, drifting ghost-like past the lighted window. I move the curtain to let in the morning light. A tracery of fragile ferns and glittering flowers are newly etched on the glass. They are so delicate. I've never seen such a thing before. Surely it's some kind of magic, invisible fairy fingers, meddling elfin eyes watching. I have seen it all around me since we moved from London, like the delicate rings of toadstools in dew-drenched turf, that fleeting feeling that hidden eyes are watching from the hedgerows and wind-blown grasses. But nothing compares with this frosty forest imprinted on my window this morning. There is movement downstairs. My father is opening the front door. I hear a scraping sound and the soft crunch of footsteps going towards the privy at the side of the garden. Peeping into my parents' bedroom, I see that my mother is getting dressed. "Mummy, Mummy, come and look! Look, it's so pretty!" My mother follows me to the window. "Wunderschön, Christel. Frost flowers," she said. "You must enjoy them now, because when the sun comes up, they'll disappear." A couple of years before, when I was in Great Ormond Street Hospital with a bad ear infection, Grandma gave me a book about different flower fairies. I know that every flower has its own fairy, so I can guess that the frost fairies made these ones. I sit by the window, snuggled in my eiderdown, and trace the outline of the ferns with my finger. The glass is icy cold. I wish I could draw as beautifully as the frost fairies. Miranda stirs, yawns, and stretches her plump baby arms. She sits up. "Come and look." My sister drops down from her bed and toddles over to the window. She shivers. 2 fingers slip into her mouth. "The frost fairies came in the night and made them for us," I show her, "but Mummy says they'll soon disappear." Miranda, eyes wide, sucks on her fingers, twiddling the collar of her brushed cotton nightdress. I pull on my woolly dressing gown, and then I help her on with hers. We go through our parents' bedroom and climb down the steep spiral stone stairs that lead directly into the living room. There are only a few frost ferns framing the window down here. Through the clear space at the centre of the glass, a bright white landscape leaps to greet us. I rush over to kneel on the wooden settle to see. A thick, snowy blanket camouflages everything. It makes the familiar landscape strange. It's filled with mysterious, unidentifiable shapes. The mountain opposite has disappeared completely into the pale grey sky. It's as if the world stops at the end of our garden, as if our farmhouse is hanging at the edge of a precipice to nothing. For a moment I feel dizzy. I turned to look at the room, comforted by its warmth and the big saucepan of porridge steaming on top of the stove. My father opens the front door. He stamps his feet, knocking his boots against the door frame. Chunks of hard snow drop from his boots onto the doorstep. Then he steps into the house in his socks, while the melting snow makes puddles on the stone floor. He claps his hands together to get feeling back into his fingers. He rarely tells us anything or starts conversation, but today he says, "It's frozen over, the snow, even the pond, thick ice." "Can we go out in it? Can we, Mummy, can we?" "Yes, after you've had some breakfast." "But it might melt by then." "There'll be more coming. You'll have to go out before it starts snowing again," our father says. "Oh, please, Mummy, can we?" She smiles as she ladles porridge into blue and white bowls. "Natürlich. Of course you can go when you've eaten. I will come outside and play too. I love the snow. Such winters we would have in Germany, sledging. Ach, it was such fun. Together we will make a big snowman." I sprinkle black muscovado sugar onto my porridge and watch as it slowly melts in the heat. I am as excited as I was last month when Father Christmas came. I can hardly wait for breakfast to be over. At last I dress in my warmest clothes, woolen leggings, a warm skirt and jumper over cosy underwear, coat and hat, scarf and mittens. It seems to take forever. I put on my thickest socks and pull on my black Wellington boots. I'm ready. I have so many layers on that I can hardly move. At last we were allowed out into our strange new world. I step carefully onto the snow, surprised by a slight resistance. Then my foot breaks the icy crust and sinks. It's deep. It comes halfway up my boots. With every step my feet make crunchy sounds. The icy air makes me cough, and it makes the skin on my face tingle. I look back at the farmhouse. Mummy is helping Miranda, who's dressed in a green snowsuit with fur around the hood. She lifts her over the snow because it's too deep for her little boots. Our father has gone to fetch his camera. As the day brightens, the snow blushes pink and the shadows take on a purple tinge. In the sunlight, the snow sparkles like a million tiny diamonds. Birds leave dainty footprints on the even surface. Their tracks seem to go round in circles. Mummy shows us how to roll the snow into a giant snowball to make the body of our snowman. I'm a bit disappointed. On Christmas cards, snowmen stand on smooth, snowy fields. Around ours, the snow is trodden down, dirty, hard-packed from our feet and from collecting snow. The ground looks ugly and spoilt. Mummy fetches a carrot for the snowman's nose and an old hat for his head. "What can we use for his eyes and mouth?" she asks, but I have already found 2 shiny pieces of black coal for his eyes. "Those red berries would make a good mouth," she says, pointing to the holly bush in the corner of the garden. I stomp across the garden to collect some. "Mind the prickly leaves!" The snowman is just about finished when the first new flakes begin to fall. I open my mouth and let them float into it. It looks as if it should taste of sugar, but I only taste icy blandness. The taste of snow is so disappointing. Now it starts snowing heavily, and Mummy says we must go in and watch from the window. I hardly leave the window all day. It's so exciting. It snows all day long. "It's getting very deep," my father says when he comes in from the milking. "The roads will be impassable, especially if it freezes over tonight. We'll be snowed in." There's something so cosy about being snowed in. I love it. I suppose Mummy might be worried about not getting food delivered, although she's stocked up well for the winter. But for us, it is exciting. By the next morning, our snowman stands in a pristine landscape of snow, exactly like a Christmas card. His hat is covered with it, and even his carrot nose carries a little ridge of white along its length. Every day the icicles grow until they hang like ancient glass stalactites from the farmhouse roof. It is summer. In the garden, we two small girls huddle in a shady corner. We're mixing earth with water, torn-up leaves and flower petals in cracked china bowls decorated with faded pink roses, a make-believe soup. On a washing line, stretched down one side of the garden, white sheets move gently in the warm sun. A clump of goldenrod holds gilded blossom on regal stalks, while purple pansies genuflect at its feet. Our voices rise above the hum of bees busying themselves deep in the purple bells of foxgloves. My soup is better than yours. A short argument ensues, ending in reluctant agreement. Both muddy soups are good in their own way, although secretly I know mine is best. Grasshoppers in the field beyond the garden wall chirp in lazy rhythms, while butterflies fill the garden with a whisper of wings. A cow moos in desultory fashion somewhere nearby, and the dogs lay panting in the shade of the wall. Only the cat seems alert, unblinking, watching for field mice from the top of the wall, her ears and whiskers twitching. Canes supporting runner beans frame the vegetable plot, rich in crops. Beans hang in long, glossy clusters, ready for picking, still lit by a few late crimson flowers. Lettuces, limp-leaved in the sun, cry out for water. By the house door, our mother sits on a stool shelling peas into an enamelled bowl. The pods open with a satisfying pop, and the young peas plop into the pan, a sweet green harvest. "Look, Mummy, soup, you taste it." She takes the broken bowl from my hands and pretends to drink. Lovely, Chrissy. You make good soup. What are these?" She points to snowberries floating in the muddy brown mixture. "Potatoes, of course. Mummy, can I have some pea shells?" Pea shells are a favourite. We snap them and peel off the tough inner skin, and then chew on the tender shells, the green, fresh taste filling our mouths. We forget our make-believe soup. It can't compete with this treat. Now we settle ourselves at our mother's feet, watching the bowl gradually filling and working our way through the discarded pods. Many years later, I am on holiday with friends when I hear voices flute softly through the Salzburg Museum shop. I move closer to the speakers so that I can hear more clearly. Tyrolean melodies, German folk harmonies, forgotten pleasures that had been submerged since childhood rise to the surface of my mind. I was 10 years old. To grown-ups, the war was still a recent memory. We lived in Wales, and it was to Wales the Obernkirchen Children's Choir came in 1953 from a defeated Germany to win at the International Festival of Music at Llangollen with their song Mein Vater war ein Wandersmann. Hearing those children's happy voices and being so poignantly reminded of her homeland was deeply emotional for my mother. The song topped the hit parade for 23 weeks. For 6 months, the BBC broadcast that song until we all knew it by heart. It could have been then that I first came to love German folk songs, but maybe it was long before that, for perhaps they were sung to us from the moment we were born. I don't remember. But I do remember that from the summer of 53, we would skip along the farm track across the mountain, swinging our arms and singing, Mein Vater war ein Wandersmann und mir steckt's auch im Blut. Drum wandr ich flott, solang ich kann und schwenke meinen Hut. Walderie, Waldera, Walderie, Waldera, ha 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 ha, Walderie, Waldera und schwenke meinen Hut. I had forgotten all of this, but here in Salzburg I recognise the sound. Not children's voices this time, not the happy wanderer, but adults voicing those familiar sound patterns, familiar harmonies. I find an assistant. Bitte, können Sie Englisch sprechen? Of course she can speak English perfectly. They all can these days. She goes off to find the CD for me. My friends, waiting patiently outside in the sunshine, think I'm mad to spend €19 on such music. But Miranda doesn't. When I get home, I play it for her and her eyes light up. For us, this is the music of memory. It belongs to our childhood, speaks of mountains, breezes laden with the scent of bracken and heather, of walking in the woods, of carolling those sweet Tyrolean harmonies on a Welsh hillside. In the beginning, there was no water supply in our farm cottage. A stream trickled through a pipe into an open tank on the mountainside behind the cowshed. Water had to be carried in buckets for all our drinking, washing and cooking needs. It was good, clear spring water, and the spring was a few hundred yards up the mountain, and sheep and other animals drank from the stream. Perhaps we had to boil all the water at first, I don't remember. It must have been arduous work, though, and piping water into the house was one of my father's first jobs to make life on the farm more acceptable to my mother. Once he had done that, we had cold water on tap at the huge stone sink in the kitchen. I don't remember ever having hot running water. We had to boil kettles. I don't know how my parents managed to bathe, but we children would have our baths in that big kitchen sink, with my mother bringing kettles full of hot water for us. When we were done, we would climb out, stepping down onto the wooden chair, and wrap ourselves in towels warmed by the Rayburn stove in the living room. Whether or not that big yellow solid fuel stove was there when we moved in, I'm not sure. I suspect that it was not, and that it was installed soon after we arrived. It became the centre of everything in that little cottage. It was where my mother cooked our meals, baked bread, and heated water for washing us and the clothes. It was where the washing dried on days when it was too wet to hang it out on the line. It warmed the whole house, its heat filtering through the spaces between the wooden boards that doubled as downstairs ceilings and bedroom floor. My father would feed its voracious mouth from a tall scuttle filled with the best quality anthracite coal, black gold from local coal mines. We were rewarded with a constant supply of comfort. When we arrived there, we had no means of lighting the place except for candles and oil lamps. I don't think Mum had ever lived without electricity before. This was a step back to a really primitive existence for her. She was rather afraid of the lamps and the way they popped and spluttered when lit, and loathed the smell of paraffin. Candlelight was always her preferred lighting, but it was not good enough to read by, and for a while reading was almost the only form of entertainment, although I don't remember ever being without a radio during my childhood, so perhaps we had a transistor radio that ran on batteries. It was always tuned to either the home service or the third programme. My father's favourite programmes were Take It From Here, The Goon Show and The Archers, and there was always classical music playing as a background to our lives. The first time I became really hooked to a radio show was when Journey into Space was aired for the first time. I found it hard to wait patiently for a whole week to hear the next episode. I was hooked on sci-fi from then on. Our most prized possessions in those days were our torches. We each had our own and used them to go out through the dark garden to the cold, spider-infested wooden privy at the side of the barn, or to see our way as we climbed the steep stone staircase to the bedroom. Before too long, our father installed gas pipes in the house, and suddenly the house seemed brighter. We had great tanks of colour gas delivered to the side of the house. The fragile gas mantles popped almost as scarily as the oil lamps, and the gas had a smell that was in its own way as unpleasant as the smell of paraffin, but at least we could read without straining our eyes. After we had been there for a while, the electricity board had a new scheme to bring power lines across the mountains to the farms. However, they wanted the farmers to pay for the installation. There were protests, as there often are at expensive modern innovations. Many farmers were reluctant to pay, and the fewer there were who joined the scheme, the more expensive it was going to be for those who wanted it. We were very much in favour of getting back into the 20th century after our little excursion into an almost medieval existence, and it was very exciting for us the day that electricity came to the mountain. At last our little cottage glowed brightly at the touch of a switch, and from then on my torch was kept under my pillow to be used only for clandestine readings after my mother had told us to put out the bedside lamps and go to sleep. Soon after that, we also had the telephone installed, and we were no longer so isolated from the outside world. All this time, my mother had kept up her friendship with Hans Werner, receiving regular letters from him. He corresponded with me too. The letters I had sent him were bordered with childish crayon drawings of flowers and butterflies, and sometimes I would illustrate things I wrote about in the body of the letter. In return, he encouraged me in everything, liked my drawings, and told me about his visits to art exhibitions, museums, and concerts in London. At birthdays and Christmas, exciting brown paper parcels arrived in the post, containing books smelling of new paper, printer's ink, and bookbinder's glue, inscribed with "Love from Hans Werner," and the date in his spidery hand. Everything that came from Hans Werner seemed special. For a man who had never married or had children, he seemed to have a real talent for knowing how to buy things that were exciting and educational at the same time. After a while, a great longing grew in me to experience London and all its cultural treasures for myself. When it was that I first learned about Hans Werner's family history, I can't remember. It must have been some time after a holiday we had in London, when I was about 11 years old. Mum, Miranda and I went to London, leaving my father behind to mind our farm. One of the disadvantages of farming is the impossibility of everyone getting away together. We stayed with my grandparents in Forest Hill. During that week we met Hans Werner several times. He treated us to a memorable day at London Zoo, and one very wet night took us to Sadler's Wells Ballet. I remember so well that my sister insisted on wearing a sprigged muslin bridesmaid's dress that I had worn 4 years earlier at our Aunt Molly's wedding. Molly was Wilfred's younger sister. Because of the heavy rain, she had to wear her navy gabardine school mackintosh over it, which was slightly too small for her. The rain-spattered frills of the white dress hung limply from below the school raincoat, which I thought looked embarrassingly ridiculous. I remember being so ashamed and walking a few yards behind, trying to pretend I wasn't with her as she skipped happily along the dark London pavements, holding hands with Hans Werner. It was on this holiday that I developed a genuine liking and huge respect for this man, who was my mother's oldest friend. I think that was when I started to ask my mother questions about him. Because Mum didn't drive and the nearest shops to the farm were 5 miles away, we had food delivered once a week by a local firm, Jenkins the grocer. Every week the van bumped up the farm track and the driver would bring boxes of goodies. Always a dozen oranges, apples, wholemeal flour, yeast, brown sugar, cheddar cheese, dried lentils, and anything else we needed. One day, Mum had a visit from Mr. Jenkins, the grocer himself. "I've come here to tell you that I can't give you any more credit, Mrs. Green," he told her. "You haven't paid your bills in months. Unless you pay up today, we won't be delivering groceries to you in future." My mother was very shocked. "But every week I pay the drivers," she told him. "I don't owe you any money." "Come on, Mrs. Green, do you expect me to believe you rather than the delivery man who's been with me for years?" She felt the unspoken words, "a foreigner," behind that "you." Wait here, I can show you." She was shaking as she went into the kitchen. She returned with a long hook with a stack of receipts attached to it. "I have all the bills. See, he signed them all. Every week I paid." He examined each bill carefully. On every one was the word paid, and each was signed by the driver. Jenkins gave them back to her and shook his head. "Well, I do apologise, Mrs. Green. I can see from these that you don't owe me a penny. It's a good thing you kept these bills, mind, or I would never have believed you." The driver was sacked, and the firm continued to supply us with our grocery needs, but my mother was very upset by the whole affair. "I would always be so nice to that driver," she said. "I gave him cups of tea, and he would laugh and joke with me, and all the time he was cheating me. How could he have done that? And if I hadn't kept those receipts, what would have happened to me?"